Good. Well, this is my topic. This is who I am and where I am in Sydney on the western shore of the Pacific Ocean. Greetings, therefore, from Australia, which is perhaps a different, sometimes regarded as also a semi-peripheral country, though in this case a different kind of semi-periphery. So I thought I would start with that reflection. Uh, this is a picture of a scene in the national capital, Canberra, taken some years back. You can see some of our Indigenous um, vegetation in the background, at least on the right-hand side, with a classic Australian eucalyptus tree. But on the ground in the forefront is the encampment of a protest, which this is in the grounds or just in front of the Parliament building, the centre of the national government. And a group of Aboriginal people have maintained what they call a tent embassy to the government of Australia, as if from another country, making the point quite dramatically that modern Australia is a settler colony. The majority of the population came from Europe, most particularly from Britain, in a process of basically low intensity warfare through the 19th century, comparable in many ways to what happened in Canada, comparable to what happened in Argentina, where the indigenous population, or most of it, was killed off in one way or another, though not completely. Aboriginal culture massively disregarded, discredited, and a new state, a colonial state, basically set up by the settler population alone. So I'm part of that settler population. I'm descended from migrants who came to this continent in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century. One of the great waves of European migration to Australia then. My education was basically in the school and university system set up by the settler regime, starting in the 19th century, carrying through to the 20th and the 21st. So I did my degrees at the University of Melbourne and the University of Sydney. But then I went to Chicago, and that, of course, is typical of the careers of academics in Australia, who ideally would go to the global north to do their PhD, though I did my PhD in Australia, and I was one of the first generation to do that. But we would normally travel for updating to the elite institutions of the global north, particularly the English-speaking global north. And that's exactly what I did. I went for a postdoctoral year to the University of Chicago. At a later stage, I went for a sabbatical year, a year of study to the University of London, and thus came to participate as an active member in a certain economy of knowledge, which is often, though I think wrongly, called Western science, including the humanities and social sciences, as practiced and as principally developed in the elite institutions of the great colonizing powers, France, Britain, Italy, Germany, United States, which of course started as a settler colony and then became an imperial power in its own right. Spain, which was important in the early international spread of universities. Now, I object to the term Western science, partly because I live in the far southeast, in terms of those particular coordinates, but mainly because it seems to me historically mistaken term. It suggests, and is usually understood to mean, that the knowledge formation, which provides the curriculum of most universities in the world today, somehow arose from indigenous cultures of Western Europe and perhaps some of its overseas settlements. And I think this is mistaken. I would call this knowledge formation an form of imperial knowledge or imperial science rather than Western, strictly speaking, because it is genuinely global. And although it is organized in a hierarchical way, which has privileged the kinds of institutions that I and my colleagues went to and wished to be recognized by in Europe, Western Europe and North America. Nevertheless, the development of the modern research-based knowledge formation has depended quite crucially on flows of information from the colonized world. Over the last 500 years or so, there's been an immense process, a global, the worldwide process of extraction of information, of data, like to use that terminology, from the colonized world, including the semi-colonized world and the parts of the world that were not strictly conquered by European powers, but nevertheless were brought into the economic and cultural regime that they created. And that flow is something that you can see, although it's not often recognized in mainstream histories of science written in the global north. You can nevertheless see it in some of the key documents produced in Europe. Here's an example. This is an illustration from one of the many books written by Alexander von Humboldt, one of the most influential scientists, European scientists of the 19th century. It's a diagram showing the distribution of plants in tropical regions of South America. Alexander von Humboldt had gone to the Spanish colonies of the northern part of South America and spent several years there, in fact, collecting plants, traveling the landscape, climbing the mountains, which he thought were the highest in the world, and brought back on his return to Europe vast quantities of data, specimens, notes, illustrations, and so on, which were then assembled as in this diagram, which is a kind of meant to be a kind of cross section of that part of the continent, from the Atlantic on one side to the Pacific on the other, showing the height at which he actually found different species of plants and the kinds of surroundings that they might have been in. So it's actually an early representation of what we might now call botanical ecology or something of that sort. Humboldt was also one of the founders of climate science, and that's a relevant observation because that process of gathering information from the colonial or post-colonial world, from the global south broadly understood, is still going on. If you look, for instance, at the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you'll find this same pattern that you found in 19th century biology and natural physical sciences, where the principal theorists were resident in Western Europe or perhaps the eastern part of North America by then. But the data they were working on came, a very large part of it actually came from the colonized world. We now collect much of this data remotely through satellites and so forth, but it's still where much of it comes from. So the process of assembling, of extracting information from one part of the world, assembling it, gathering it in institutions like botanic gardens, libraries, museums, and the academic disciplines themselves. That is still going on. And if you look at the footnotes of one of the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you'll still see that, that process happening. So as the research-based knowledge system matured, if you like, it gave a central role to the elite institutions of the colonial power, the colonizing powers, the imperial center, which is why I call this an imperial rather than a Western system of knowledge. But that hierarchy that was created and the division of labor between theorizing and application in the global north and data collection in the global south, that has implications for workers in the periphery and knowledge workers in the periphery and the semi-peripheries too. And this is something I came to appreciate particularly as a result of the work of Pauline Huntonji, a philosopher from Benin in West Africa, recently passed on, I'm sorry to say, and I'm sad to say I never actually met him. Though the first time I read his work, I was stunned by it and, in fact, shivered because he was someone from West Africa who was describing an intellectual and cultural experience which was very close to what I had experienced in settler colony in Australia. Pentonji described the stance that this global imperial knowledge system requires of knowledge workers in the periphery. He described this stance or attitude as extraversion, meaning not exactly what Jung meant. It's not an attitude, not a kind of emotion or a personality type, but rather it's an attitude or a stance in which you do your work as an intellectual, as a scientist. The point Hintonji centrally was making was that a knowledge worker in the periphery must be oriented to the intellectual authority of the global center, of the metropole, as it might be called in French. Because to teach in a university in Nigeria or Australia or Benin, you must understand the concepts, you must be literate in the ideas, and the methods, and the concepts which have been developed in the elite institutions of the global north. That is what defines the the disciplines that you're teaching and the research field that you might be trying to make your name in, whatever it might be. You cannot function in this knowledge system from the majority world, the post-colonial world, unless you have that necessary orientation to the global north. Now, I want to develop some implications of this basic concept that we knowledge workers are necessarily, not as a condition of our labour, indeed as a condition of our jobs, because in Australia, for instance, if you want to get an academic job, you better have published in some journals in the global north. And of course, the editors of journals in the global north will not publish your work if it's written exclusively in the conceptual language of your own part of the world. It must connect with the work of the elite institutions of the global north. That's what defines an elite journal, in effect. Okay, now the creation of this imperial knowledge structure had another massive implication for intellectual life in the colonized world. It excluded forms of knowledge and particular groups of knowledge workers from the developing disciplinary knowledge. Forms of indigenous knowledge were simply discarded, in effect, regarded as primitive, often regarded as a kind of superstition, or at any rate as something that is purely of anthropological or literary interest, not as something that contributes to the development of the dominant knowledge system in the world. And when I was thinking about this, I was reminded of a couple of lines in a poem by Wisława Szymborska, whom I read in English since I cannot read the original, but it's still a striking observation where she says, and I quote in English, of course, history did not greet us with fanfare. It flung dirty sand in our eyes. And I have a feeling that that's what the imperial knowledge system did to knowledge workers in the majority world. In fact, flung dirty sand in our eyes so that we could not recognize, in a way, what came out of colonized cultures as knowledge worthy of recognition and development. I will come back to that in a few minutes, that thought. But first, now we have the imperial knowledge system there. How do we map it? How do we understand it? Well, first of all, I think is a huge division of labor and hierarchy between center, broadly understood, and periphery or peripheries, broadly understood too. Theory on the one side, data gathering on the other. Authority and the followers of authority. That hierarchy shifts over time. The center itself shifts. The system is by no means homogeneous. It's fractured and divided in various ways. But that is a very powerful pattern, which certainly shaped my academic life and shaped, I'm sure, the lives of academics all around the world. But we can't easily understand it simply by dividing the world into two clear-cut categories. Things change. There are processes that undermine as well as processes that reinforce that division of labour and that hierarchy of authority. That's why I now have come to talk about the dynamics of the global economy of knowledge, thinking about ways in which it changes. And the most spectacular change in very recent years, I'd suggest, is the result of developments in China, where the Chinese government, since the time of the Cultural Revolution, has poured very large funds into the development of a university system in China. And since the last decade of the 20th century, it's poured big funds into trying to create a tier of elite research universities. With some success, particularly in areas like biomedical science and engineering related sciences. But with the overall effect that China has now passed the United States as the country which publishes the majority of the greatest number of papers in academic journals, if you take all disciplines together. China is now at the top of the national league table of academic publications, something that would hardly have been believed 30 years ago. Nevertheless, the United States and Western Europe still produce most of the journals, even in those fields. And a few years ago, certainly before the main surge of Chinese output, some ingenious British geographers produced a map of the world showing the journals, the countries which published journals with the country shown with area proportional to the number of peer-reviewed academic journals that they publish. You see the United States and the United Kingdom, the Anglo elite journals, predominant, Western Europe making up the rest, and most of the rest of the world practically absent from these counts at all. That would now have changed a bit. China over there on the right would now bulk larger, but the predominance of North America and Western Europe would still be in such a map quite striking. Okay, I have used the language of South and North in my book Southern Theory, and I still find that useful, though it has complications, of course. The concept of Global South, arose in the era of the Bandung Conference in the mid-1950s, then the development of the United Nations Committee on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, in the 1960s, when the language of Global South really became popularized in United Nations debates. Basically, South and North, although there are ways of defining those in terms of average levels of income and so forth, basically that reflects the old distinction between colonizers and colonized that created the imperial economy. And the history of colonization, the creation of colonial societies, still shapes the history of post-colonial regions in quite profound ways. Here I draw on the arguments of a Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, um, who has written extensively on political economy um, of Latin America, and developed the concept for which, in fact, he became famous, of the coloniality of power. It's an argument about the way institutions developed in the colonial context of Latin America, particularly in the Spanish-speaking colonies, where the state, the colonial state, church, and economic institutions such as corporations developed in ways that were centrally oriented to the colonizing power, that is, to the state and the economy of the imperial center. So that when knowledge institutions began to be set up in the Spanish-speaking colonies, which happened very early, actually, happened in the 16th century, the first universities and colleges began to be set up by in the Spanish colonial world. They too, the knowledge institutions too, showed this pattern of coloniality. And then when these regions became politically independent, when they gained independence from in the wars of independence, this pattern of orienting the state, cultural institutions and economic institutions to the imperial power remained. That was not abolished by achieving political independence. So Quijano's observation applies to post-colonial countries and regions, as well as to the colonial period itself. The institutional patterns are still oriented to the metropole, and obviously enough, knowledge institutions, including universities, show that pattern. And that is very strikingly the case in Australia, where the initial universities, the two in which I was a student, were set up in the mid-19th century, in fact in the 1850s, by the British colonisers at exactly the same time that the British Empire was setting up universities in India to train elite workforce for the Indian Empire, the British Indian Empire. And not long before, the British also set up universities in their colonies in Canada and South Africa. Now, our problem in relating to post-colonial theory, our Australian problem in relating to post-colonial theory and decolonial theory and the work of people like Quijano, is that we are not a colony of conquest. We didn't have, if you like, a majority indigenous population as in Africa, as in the British colonies in southern Asia. Australia was an example of what's now called settler colonialism, where the settler population, in fact, constitutes the majority of the population. Nowadays, the large majority of the population. And that creates, in some ways, a different situation, but one which still shows this pattern of coloniality, where our institutions remain oriented to whatever the power centres or the economic centres in the global economy might be, rather than developing an autonomous culture or an autonomous economy in this region. Now, you will, of course, recognize some of these dynamics in Eastern Europe with a different pattern of history, obviously, because you have not been influenced by overseas colonization in the way that Latin America has, and the southern tier um, of settler colonies has been. And I guess your concerns about autonomy or intellectual dependence also take, in some ways, a different shape because you have fairly obviously a majority um, a population which has never been transported um, to the countries concerned. Um, so that instead of a demographic uh, displacement of local cultures, um, you, I guess, have been grappling much more with problems of hegemony, of intellectual or cultural hegemony and autonomy. And although that is also an issue for intellectual workers in places like Australia, Argentina, Canada, um, that the social setting of it resonates differently, I think. But I would be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Okay, well, those are some thoughts on the shape of the global economy of knowledge and some of the processes of change that have occurred already. But I'm interested, as in the book that Ivan kindly mentioned, The Good University, in processes of change that might lead to a greater democratization in the global economy of knowledge. And therefore, I've been concerned with what resources there might be for change in a more democratic and inclusive direction, to breaking down the massive hierarchy that this economy of knowledge has had in the past. Okay, one of the resources for change, I think, is in the knowledge systems that were discarded in the colonized world, in the process of colonization. So that when the British set up their universities in India, they didn't include Indigenous knowledge in the curriculum. There was a Eurocentric curriculum. Exactly the same thing in Australia. Our curriculum in the university set up from the 1850s on was wholly imported from London, from Oxbridge, from Edinburgh, and so forth. And it's taken until this generation before any Aboriginal knowledge was included in university curriculum in Australia. And it's still in a very marginal position. But we now can recognise that there is, in fact, a serious knowledge system there, which I illustrate with this painting by an Aboriginal artist from the Central Desert of Australia. It's known as honey ant dreaming, and it's a record of Indigenous knowledge. The knowledge is partly geographical because this is a diagram of where you find water in the arid desert country known to this particular community. It's a record of biological knowledge because this is also a memory of where particular animals, in this case honey ants, a species of ant that accumulates honey and is a food source for the particular Aboriginal community. And it's also a record of social knowledge because it records the time and the ceremonies that accompany the movement of the community to the area where honey ants and water are found in the course of its original lifestyle and exploitation of the natural resources of the area. So it's what we might call an interdisciplinary knowledge formation, represented in a totally different way from knowledge in biological or geographical journals might be, but it's there, it's organized, it's knowledge organized differently, but serious knowledge and indeed life-saving knowledge for the community involved. And I could give many, many other examples of that. So I want to argue that this is a resource for change in the global economy of knowledge, among other things, encouraging us to think of different patterns of organization of knowledge from the ones that we are accustomed to. Then there is, as a knowledge resource, the experience of coloniality itself, of being colonized or of living in a colonial society. And there are many generations of intellectuals in the colonized world who have thought about their situation of being colonized and tried to develop intellectual responses to it. This is a photograph from the end of the 19th century from Indonesia, what is now Indonesia, which was at the time the Dutch East Indies. And this is a young woman of the indigenous Muslim upper class who conceived the idea, learnt Dutch, learnt to write, which was unusual for women in those colonies, and conceived the idea of being a writer, being an intellectual contributor, and setting up schools for women. So she was an educational innovator who developed a strategy, if you like, for developing knowledge institutions and achieving social change through the impact of those knowledge institutions. Well, she died very young, regrettably, but she became a national heroine and is in fact almost the patron saint of women's organizations in Indonesia to this day. Indonesia is, in terms of population, the largest Muslim country in the world. So it is a significant arena of cultural change. Finally, there are resources in the, thank you. In the post-colonial world too, in the colonized world after independence and after a degree of political autonomy. This is a woman whom I think of as one of the most important feminist theorists of the 20th and 21st centuries, Bina Agarwal, a development economist, feminist, socialist feminist, social researcher, quite fascinating worker, who's theorized the interplay between society and the land, society and the environment. She's a significant environmental economist too, based on researches across South Asia and the concerns particularly of South Asian women as workers, as landholders, or as people who have some claim to rights to use and ownership of land and agricultural and forestry resources. So she's an example of the kind of researcher who can come out of post-colonial contexts with a somewhat different intellectual agenda from that which is dominant in the hegemonic institutions of the global north. Because if you look at social theory in the global north, questions of land and land use are not very prominent, but they are, of course, central to the issues in colonization and in many post-colonial countries too. Okay, those are some of the kinds of resources we might be, be looking for and building from. But how do you actually do it? What is the agenda, if you like, for change in the global economy of knowledge to push it in more democratic directions using those kinds of resources? I think there's no question that it requires us to think about remaking the labour process of knowledge workers, of how the definition, collecting of information and theorising is actually done. And here I want to mention um, what's now a very important text in post-colonial knowledge um, debates uh, by a book by Linda Tuhiwai Smith from Aotearoa, New Zealand, the island country in the Pacific to the east of Australia. She's from the Indigenous Maori community and has written, this is now in its second edition, um, a book which concerns social research on Maori communities as the cultural capacities of Maori communities themselves were increasingly asserted and control over knowledge about the Indigenous population became an important issue in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in the politics of the country. So this offers, in fact, procedural recommendations for how you actually do research in a way um, that yields control of the research effort to the communities themselves, to Indigenous people themselves. And that has made this book very influential, as similar kinds of issues about the ownership and control of knowledge have bubbled up in other parts of the world in debates about knowledge and coloniality in many parts of the world, in fact. There is one slightly unfortunate consequence of this that Linda Tuhiwai Smith is basically talking about qualitative social research uh, concerned to produce understandings and cultural change. And of course, a great deal of social research and a great deal of natural research too is not qualitative, it is quantitative. So there is a tendency in some of the literature to think of quantitative work as Western and qualitative work as potentially Indigenous or non-Western. And I think that is wrong both ways. And that's well shown by this book, which I also recommend to you, by two Indigenous authors, one Australian, my colleague Maggie Walter, and one from Canada, Indigenous Statistics, which works out how statistical analyses of Indigenous populations have in fact been a site of the assertion of colonial power in the past, and how Indigenous communities are now able to push back, in fact, and assert control over the kind of data that's collected, how it's analysed, and how it's then used. And although that's not as well known as Linda's qualitative book is, I think it is, in general terms, equally important. So the issue that Maggie and Chris raise, they call the issue of data sovereignty. Sovereignty, of course, being the crucial issue between Indigenous and settler populations in contemporary Indigenous politics. So the The colonizing process basically asserted control, sovereignty over data from the moment that it entered the flows to the metropole. But that can now be challenged retrospectively as well as in contemporary science. That's one thing that we have to do in democratizing the system, is to analyze and rework the labor processes of knowledge production and circulation. Any labor process, of course, requires a workforce. And it's the knowledge workforce that actually produces and sustains the economy of knowledge that I think also needs really serious attention in any project to democratize the global system. One of the differences between the elite institutions of the global north and the situations of most knowledge workers in the post-colonial majority world is simply the level of resources they have. Okay, if you go to Stanford, you're in an institution which has an endowment of $40 billion. Harvard has more. These are not the same kind of institutions as your poverty-stricken public college in rural Australia, let alone in rural India. There are enormous differences in the resources. And so one of the questions we might face if we're seriously trying to democratize this system, how do we change the distribution of resources? Resources being financial and material, as well as resources of authority and recognition. That, I think, is a crucial issue, and therefore I think it's important to think about institutions like this. This is an institution called CODESRIA, the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa. This is its headquarters in Dakar, in Western Africa. Pedestria is easy to know something about because it has an excellent website and publishes open access journals, which are easy to find, and I'll give you the spelling in just a moment. How we support workforces around the post-colonial world and the semi-peripheral world is one of the big questions. Aid to support institutions like this, networks, alternative mechanisms for circulating knowledge, such as the databases that have now been developed in Latin America, Cielo, the SCIELO, is perhaps the best known of those. How we support these in the long run, or get the holders of the majority of the world's wealth to support them, is one of the political issues that we face. But for this particular moment, I think we also face quite serious questions, quite serious issues of supporting the knowledge workforce in the global north too. If you think about what the Trump administration has been doing, and its allies in the Republican Party in the United States, been doing to universities in the United States. The attacks on Harvard is one sign of that. The right-wing takeover of universities in Florida, which is less well known, but rather, at this point, rather more terrifying. At this point, I think knowledge workers in the elite institutions of the global north are also in need of a bit of support. And I think some of that should come from will have to come from the wider world. Okay, I'm sorry I've gone on a little bit longer than I had intended, but I am at the end now. That's where you'll find the book that was mentioned, which has a chapter on the global economy of knowledge, which would be a little bit more coherent than my talk today has been. And these are the names of the people and groups that I mentioned, if you should want to look them up. Okay, that's my
Okay. Thank you. I will stop the recording here.